picture a Viking, what's the first thing that springs to mind? Probably a huge bearded warrior clad in furs, an axe in one hand, wearing a massive helmet topped with horns. He's wild, dirty, speaking some crude language, dreaming only of plunder and Valhalla. Now, forget all that, because almost every single detail of that image is a complete Hollywood myth. Today, we're going to dive into 20 facts about the Vikings that will shatter those stereotypes once and for all. You'll discover why they were cleaner than most Europeans of the time, how they discovered America 500 years before Columbus, and why the horned helmet is the single biggest lie in their history. Ready to learn the truth the movies hide? Then let's get started. But first, a quick question for you. What's your very first association with the word Viking? Drop a comment below. It will be interesting to compare your thoughts before and after watching. Before we start busting these myths, let's establish who exactly we're talking about. The Viking Age was a period in European history roughly stretching from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century. And Viking wasn't the name of an entire people. It was more like a job description. It referred to the seafarers, warriors, raiders, and merchants who originated from Scandinavia, modern-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Most inhabitants of these lands were ordinary farmers, artisans, and fishermen who never left home. It was those who embarked on voyages, the Vikings, who earned that infamous reputation. Many of their stereotypes only emerged much later. They were created first by Christian monks whose monasteries suffered from the raids, and then solidified by 19th century artists and writers who romanticized the image of the northern barbarian. While modern movies and TV shows, of course, have taken that image to the point of absurdity. Now that we've set the context, let's get straight to the facts. Let's start with the most important fact. The idea of Vikings wearing horned helmets is complete fiction. Archaeologists have never recovered a single genuine Viking helmet adorned with horns. The only comparable artifacts discovered in Scandinavia actually date back to the Bronze Age, 1,000 years before the Viking era, and were almost certainly used for ritualistic purposes. Actual Viking helmets were designed to be purely practical and functional. The most famous surviving example, unearthed in Norway, is known as the Geirmundbu helmet. It features a simple rounded cap and a protective spectacle-style mask for the eyes and nose, but notably no horns. Imagine fighting on the deck of a ship or within a tight battle formation. Horns on a helmet would have been incredibly dangerous for the wearer. They could easily snag an enemy axe or even get caught in the rigging of their own vessel. This enduring myth was actually popularized by the costume designer Carl Emil Dupler, who created the outfits for Richard Wagner's opera, The Ring of the Nibelung, in 1876. His striking, dramatic image took root and continues to be reproduced relentlessly throughout popular culture today. Contrary to the popular image of filthy barbarians, the Vikings were actually fastidious about hygiene and personal grooming. Archaeologists routinely unearth large numbers of combs, razors, tweezers, and even specialized ear spoons, made of bone or metal, in Viking burial sites. Every Viking, male or female, maintained their own personal hygiene kit. The 13th century English chronicler John of Wallingford even complained that Danish Vikings were too attractive to English women, specifically because, and I quote, they combed their hair every day, washed every Saturday, and regularly changed their clothes. Interestingly, the word for Saturday in Scandinavian languages, lørdag or lørdag, originates from the Old Norse logardaga, which literally means washing day or bath day. So while much of the rest of Europe might have bathed only a couple of times a year, the Vikings were indulging in a weekly washing ritual. They meticulously groomed their beards and long hair, often styling them into elaborate braids. As we've mentioned before, the term Viking doesn't actually refer to a nationality or an ethnicity. The Old Norse word of vikinga simply referred to a person who embarked on a sea voyage, typically for raiding or trade. Essentially, to go a Viking was closer to saying to go out and earn a living. These individuals simply referred to themselves as Northmen, or identified by their specific region as Danes, Swedes, or Norwegians. The vast majority of people in Scandinavia led a settled life. They were farmers who worked the land, raised livestock, and practiced various crafts. Sea voyages were generally a seasonal pursuit, reserved for young, ambitious men who sought wealth, glory, or new lands to settle. When such a person returned home, they simply went back to being an ordinary farmer or landowner. Therefore, calling every person in Scandinavia from that era a Viking is like calling all modern Somalis pirates. It was an activity, not an entire population. The popular stereotype that all Vikings were towering, blue-eyed blondes is actually far from the truth. Genetic research indicates that a significant number of Vikings had brown and even dark hair. Hair and eye colour varied considerably across different regions. Blonde hair, however, was definitely considered the ideal of beauty and rugged masculinity. This led many Vikings, particularly those with darker hair, to resort to a clever trick. They used a specialised, high-alkaline soap to deliberately lighten their hair and beards, a process which gave their locks a distinctive straw blonde shade. But this wasn't purely cosmetic. The aggressive lye content in the soap proved highly effective at fighting off lice and other parasites, so it served a dual purpose, a fashion statement and a crucial hygienic practice. Picture this, a brutal, axe-wielding warrior meticulously lathering his beard with a special concoction, all in the pursuit of achieving that blonde ideal. It's a striking image that drastically changes our modern perception of these historical figures. The Vikings weren't just mindless raiders, they were, in fact, among the greatest traders, explorers, and colonizers of their era. Their sophisticated trade routes stretched all the way from North America to the Middle East. Following the rivers of Eastern Europe, they journeyed to mighty cities like Constantinople and Baghdad. There, they traded goods like furs, amber, slaves, and walrus ivory for silver, silk, and exotic spices. Even the Arab traveller Ibn Fadlan, who encountered them on the Volga River, described them as highly skilled merchants. In fact, the Vikings founded many key cities that still thrive today. Take Dublin, Ireland, for example, which was established by the Norse Vikings purely as a strategic trading outpost. They didn't just destroy, they built. They didn't just seize, they exchanged goods, technologies, and ideas, leaving an indelible mark on the development of many regions across Europe. While we often picture Vikings aboard their longships, their primary mode of transportation on land, particularly during the harsh winter months, was skiing. Scandinavians had been utilising skis for millennia, long before the Viking Age, using them for hunting, travel, and navigating snow-covered terrain. In fact, the oldest recovered skis date back as far as 6,000 years BCE. So integral were skis to their culture that Scandinavian mythology included patron deities for skiers, the god Ulla and the goddess Skadi. For the Vikings themselves, skiing was not recreation. It was a necessity. It allowed them to move quickly and silently across deep snow, granting them a tremendous advantage in both hunting and military operations. The sagas even describe warriors on skis who could outpace a running deer. Therefore, the image of the Viking skier is historically far more accurate and grounded in fact than the popular fictionalized image of a Viking wearing a horned helmet. Women in Viking society enjoyed a remarkably high level of rights, especially when compared to their counterparts across the rest of medieval Europe. Scandinavian society itself was built upon the fundamental concept of a strong, independent household. When men left for raids or voyages that lasted months or even years, women remained the absolute masters of the farm and all its assets. They could own and inherit land, possess property, and conduct their own business affairs. Crucially, a woman also had the specific right to seek divorce. If her husband treated her cruelly or failed to provide for the family, she could demand separation. Upon divorce, she was entitled to reclaim not only her original dowry, but also a share of the marital assets. The keys to the house and the longhouses were the ultimate symbol of the mistress's status, and she prominently wore them on her belt. While Viking society was certainly not fully egalitarian, The remarkable degree of freedom and respect afforded to women was truly exceptional for the era. One of the most gruesome images associated with the Vikings is the ritual known as the blood eagle. In TV shows and movies, it is often depicted as a brutal execution where the victim's back is split open, their ribs are broken, and their lungs are pulled out to form a pair of wings. It sounds terrifying. However, most modern historians doubt that this ritual was ever actually practiced. Mentions of it appear in only a handful of sagas and poems, many of which were written centuries after the events they describe. These texts are often full of metaphors and complex poetic language. It's entirely possible that the blood eagle was simply a literary device used to describe an enemy's particularly cruel death, rather than a real surgical procedure. Alternatively, it may have been propaganda created by Christian authors who sought to portray the pagan Vikings as savage and utterly inhumane. There is no direct archaeological or historical evidence confirming the existence of this execution. The concept of a unified Viking empire, or a single king ruling all the Norse people, is entirely fictional. Scandinavia during that era was fractured into countless petty kingdoms or territories, ruled by local chieftains known as konungas or jarls. These leaders constantly vied and warred with one another for land, power, and influence. The Viking armies we see in films storming places like Paris or London were rarely the forces of a single kingdom. More often, they were combined forces led by multiple chieftains, gathered for a specific campaign, only to disperse again afterward. The process of uniting Denmark, Norway, and Sweden into centralised kingdoms was incredibly long and complex, and it effectively marked the end of the Viking Age itself. Therefore, instead of a unified nation, what we are dealing with is a conglomerate of warring and allied tribes and clans. While the Vikings are primarily known for their brutal raids, not all of their expansion was violent. The settlement of Iceland stands as a prime example. This island, virtually uninhabited until the arrival of the Norse, was colonised peacefully. Beginning in the 9th century, Norwegian farmers, displeased with the policies of King Harald Fairhair, who was unifying Norway under his control and seizing ancestral lands, began seeking a new home. They gathered their families, livestock, and possessions, boarding ships to cross the harsh North Atlantic toward Iceland. There, they established new farms and created a unique, kingless society, governed by a system of general assemblies known as the Althings. This was not a conquest. It was a migration driven purely by the search for freedom and opportunity. They colonised the Faroe and Shetland Islands, and later Greenland, in much the same way. This legacy reveals the Vikings not only as fierce warriors, but also as brave pioneers and resourceful farmers. The true technological marvel of the Vikings wasn't the sword or the axe, but their ship, the drakar, or longship. These vessels represented the absolute pinnacle of engineering for that era. Their hulls were built using the clinker construction technique, where overlapping planks made the structure simultaneously incredibly sturdy and remarkably flexible. The ship could actually flex and bend with the waves instead of simply snapping. They featured an extremely shallow draft, allowing them to pull up directly onto any beach or sail far upriver, often catching enemies completely off guard. Yet, they were still robust and seaworthy enough to successfully cross the open ocean. The symmetrical design of the bow and stern meant they could quickly reverse direction without the need for a complex turnaround manoeuvre. These vessels were fast, highly manoeuvrable, and truly versatile. It was precisely this mastery of naval design that made the Viking Age possible, an era defined by vast journeys, lucrative trade, and devastating raids. The image of the Viking constantly feasting on roasted meat and drinking ale from a giant horn is actually a myth. They were first and foremost farmers, meaning their diet was based on what they could grow or gather. Grains, barley, rye, and oats formed the bulk of their meals, used for making bread, porridge, and of course, beer. Dairy products played a vital role, including milk, cheese, and skyrs, which was essentially a thick yogurt. They also cultivated vegetables like cabbage, peas, beans, and onions. While they did eat meat from domesticated animals, cows, sheep, and pigs, It was typically reserved for special occasions or feasts. In coastal areas, fish became the main staple, consumed fresh, salted, or dried. They supplemented this diet by foraging for berries, nuts, and mushrooms. Overall, their diet was quite balanced and highly nutritious, which explains why they were so strong and healthy. For the Norse, the family and the immediate clan were the very centre of their universe. Family honour was paramount, outweighing everything else, and children were seen as vital to the continuation of the lineage. Their naming system was particularly unique, as they did not use surnames in the modern sense. Instead, a child received a given name, and their second name, what we might call a patronymic, was derived from their father's name, adding son for boys or dottir, daughter, for girls. For example, Eric's son, Leif, would be known as Leif Eriksson, while his daughter Astrid would be Astrid Eriksdottir. This system, incidentally, is still fully utilised in modern Iceland. Upon a child's birth, the father had to officially recognise them by lifting them up and placing them on his knee. If he chose not to perform this ritual, the infant could be exposed or left to die. While this practice seems incredibly harsh, in the brutal conditions of the north, it was a necessary mechanism for controlling the number of mouths a family had to feed. However, once formally recognised, children were surrounded with affection and rigorously trained in all the skills necessary for survival and life in the Viking Age. Forget the stereotype of uneducated barbarians. The Vikings actually possessed a highly sophisticated culture of art and poetry. Their artisans crafted incredibly complex and beautiful objects from wood, metal and bone. Their signature style featured intricate, interwoven patterns of animals and mythological creatures, decorating everything from their longships and weaponry to fine jewellery and everyday household goods. Just look at the carved portals of the Norwegian stave churches, or the detailed ornamentation on their runestones. It is truly astonishing artistry. Beyond visual art, the Vikings held the spoken word in extremely high regard. The skalds, their court poets, were respected members of society who composed elaborate praise poems called drapa, which glorified the achievements of their jarls and kings. Skaldic poetry followed strict rules of metre and rhyme and utilised complex metaphors known as kennings. Mastering this form was a true intellectual test for both the poet and the audience. This was high art, reserved for the intellectual elite. Forget Christopher Columbus. The first Europeans to set foot on North American soil were the Vikings. Around 1000 AD, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus, an Icelandic explorer named Leif Erikson sailed west. He was the son of Eric the Red, the legendary founder of the Greenland colony, and he was searching for new territories. According to the Saga of the Greenlanders, Eriksson's expedition reached a land they called Vinland. The name, often translated as Wineland, or Land of Meadows, refers to the abundance of wild grapes or rich pastures they found there. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed as mere legend. That changed dramatically in 1960. On the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, at a site called Lons aux Meadows, archaeologists unearthed the indisputable remnants of a Norse settlement. They found the remains of turf houses, a smithy, and artefacts that unequivocally belonged to the Vikings. This discovery provided irrefutable proof of their presence in the New World 500 years before any other documented European contact. Hollywood often portrays Vikings as towering giants, dwarfing their enemies on the battlefield. But in reality, they weren't quite that massive. Studies of skeletons from Viking Age graves show that the average height for a man was about 172 centimetres, and for a woman, roughly 158 centimetres. This, notably, was slightly taller than the average European of that era, many of whom frequently suffered from malnutrition. Their superior diet, rich in protein and dairy, did make the Scandinavians generally stronger and more robust, compared, for instance, to the Anglo-Saxons. However, they were definitely not the 2-metre fantasy behemoths we see in popular fiction. Their true power didn't come from sheer size. It came from their excellent physical conditioning, superior endurance, and their legendary ferocity in combat. It's a dark and often glossed over aspect of their history, but the Vikings were prolific slave traders. During their raids on the coasts of England, Ireland, France, and the Slavic territories, they captured vast numbers of people. These captives, known as thralls, or simply slaves, were either transported back to Scandinavia to work on farms or sold at major slave markets, such as those in Dublin or further east. Slave labour was a fundamental part of the Viking economy. Thralls possessed no rights whatsoever and were considered the absolute property of their owner. The life of a thrall was brutal and often short-lived. While there were rare instances where a slave could earn their freedom, this was highly uncommon. This aspect of their activity reveals that behind the romanticised image of fearless seafarers lay the cruel reality of human trafficking and the slave trade. Berserkers are another popular historical figure surrounded by numerous myths. They are typically depicted as warriors who fall into an uncontrollable rage, feeling no pain, biting their shields, and fighting with the superhuman strength of a bear. The reality was far more complex. Berserkers were likely elite shock troops, essentially the special forces of their era. They dedicated themselves to the god Odin and would induce a state of battle trance before combat. How exactly they achieved this remains a subject of debate. It could have been through ritualistic dances, autosuggestion, or perhaps the consumption of psychoactive substances like Amanita muscaria, mushrooms. Although there is no direct proof for the latter theory, in this altered state they were undeniably dangerous and struck terror into their enemies. However, they suffered severe exhaustion and weakness once the fighting was over. In later periods, as centralised royal authority solidified in Scandinavia, berserkers were eventually outlawed and deemed criminals because their uncontrollable fury simply became too dangerous for civilised society. Runes are the ancient Germanic alphabet that the Vikings used for writing. However, contrary to common fantasy clichés, runes were not primarily magical symbols used for casting spells. Their main function was entirely practical. They were carved onto memorial stones to honour fallen kinsmen, used to mark personal property to prevent theft, and even left as short messages, similar to modern-day graffiti. Of course, like nearly any symbol in the ancient world, runes could be used for ritual purposes, such as divination or inscribed onto amulets for good luck, but this was certainly not their primary purpose. For the Vikings, runes were first and foremost a practical tool for writing and commemoration, rather than for sorcery or magic. Only a select few were trained in the difficult art of reading and carving runes, which is why rune masters commanded great respect. The Viking Age didn't end abruptly in one massive, decisive battle. It was a gradual process that stretched out over decades. One of the key factors driving its conclusion was the Christianization of Scandinavia. Adopting Christianity fundamentally shifted the Scandinavian worldview, and the Church certainly didn't approve of raiding fellow Christians. Another crucial reason was the formation of centralized states in Scandinavia, mirroring the European model. The kings of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden established standing armies, levied taxes, and consolidated their power. This effectively made the independent expeditions of local warlords unprofitable and unnecessary. The conventional end date for the Viking Age is often considered to be the year 1066. That year, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada attempted to conquer England, but was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. This marked the last major attempt by Scandinavians to invade England. The age of raids eventually gave way to an era of diplomacy and trade within a unified Christian Europe. So, let's wrap things up. The real Vikings were nothing like the popular culture caricature. Instead of filthy savages in horned helmets, we found meticulous, hygiene-conscious trendsetters who bathed weekly and even bleached their hair. Rather than mindless raiders, they were skilled traders, fearless explorers, and true pioneers who reached the Americas centuries before Columbus. We also learned that their women enjoyed rights surprisingly advanced for the era, and that their art and poetry were sophisticated and complex. The main takeaway is this: real history is always more complex, more nuanced, and far more fascinating than any stereotype. The world of the Vikings wasn't just a world of warriors, it was one of farmers, artisans, poets, and masterful seafarers, whose legacy continues to thrive in the culture and languages of countless nations. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. If this video helped you see the Vikings in a new light, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next historical deep dives. Now for the big question, which of these 20 facts surprised you the most? Or perhaps you know of another myth we failed to debunk? Let us know in the comments below. Let's keep the discussion going.